Hello and welcome to the Royal College of Surgeons of England Parents in Surgery webinar. May I have the next slide, please? This is the panel that you can see before you. I'm going to ask the panel to introduce themselves. So my name's Fiona Mint. I'm a vascular surgeon and Vice President of the College, and I've been leading on this for the College. Esther McClarty, please.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Esther McClarty. I am a consultant urologist down in Plymouth. I'm head of Peninsula Postgraduate School of Surgery and chair the Schools of Surgery group. And I'm also a mum to a 6-year-old.
Thank you. Rachel Hutchings, please.
Hi, good evening, everybody. I'm Rachel Hutchings. I'm a research fellow at the Nuffield Trust. So we're an independent healthcare policy and research organisation. We've been commissioned by the college to undertake a piece of work as part of the Parents in Surgery programme. We've done quite a lot of other bits of work relating to recruitment and retention within the NHS workforce.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And last but by no means least, Alex.
Thank you, Fiona. My name's Alex Wilkins. I'm an upper GI reg in Hull in Yorkshire. I've got 2 children and I'm on the panel because I've got experience of shared parental leave and working less than full time.
Thank you very much indeed. So may I have the next slide, please? This is really just to say that that I represent the college. Esther kind of represents the college too, don't you? So our other invited speakers are here very much with their own views. So next slide, please. So I'd like to welcome everybody to this webinar and make some apologies. Now, the apologies I'd like to make are firstly that this might be an awkward time for some of you who are parents, and we do apologise. It was rather difficult to put this together at somewhat shorter notice than we'd anticipated. So if it's bath time, I do apologise, and we're very happy to have little ones on screen or attend in the background. We don't mind. It's up to you. And the second apology I'd like to make in advance is that we understand that some of the issues that we may talk about this evening may be quite sensitive for some people. We don't wish to offend anybody. We don't wish to hurt anyone's feelings, but we understand that there have been some rather difficult journeys for some people in towards parenthood and around parenthood. So I apologise in advance if anyone comes away from this feeling a little down, and we're very happy to support you. Please make contact with us afterwards if you feel you need support afterwards. So moving on, next slide, please. So we're here today because of the Kennedy report. And this was Baroness Helena Kennedy's report that was commissioned in 2021 to look at equality, diversion and inclusion at the Royal College of Surgeons of England. She wrote a quite lengthy report. It was in some ways quite damning, and it really made us open our eyes and pull our socks up. She made 16 recommendations, which we are addressing. In fact, we've included a 17th one. But recommendation 8 was regarding parents in surgery, and Baroness Helena felt this was a very important project that we should proceed with. Next slide, please. So this is what Kennedy said in the report. The experience of parents who are training to be surgeons or are busy surgeons in practice, extremely challenging and stressful, and demands urgent attention. A task force should be established to work with deaneries, trusts and hospitals to address more supported structures and career paths. The work of the task force should feed into the restructuring planned by government. This was quite a big remit that we've been asked to take on. Next slide, please. So we thought about what our vision should be, and being a college that looks after surgeons and dental surgeons, we felt that we should include both, and that surgeons and dentists planning for or with parental and caring responsibilities, either existing, in preparation, planned or for the future, have the same access to and opportunities for employment, training and career and personal development as their peers, regardless of their background or regardless of their stage of training. Next slide, please. So this is the report that we produced, the Parents in Surgery report, and this is what we're going to talk about today. It took us a while. It's the phase 1 of our recommendation from the Kennedy report, and the phase 1 was very much an exploratory phase. We've run a few workshops, we've spoken to some of our members and fellows, and we produced this document. It is by no means the end of the story. It is very much the beginning of the story. It is not comprehensive as yet. But some of our early findings have been thus. We realise it's a very sensitive issue. Parenthood can be joyous for some, but everything to do with parenthood can be heartbreaking for others, and we do understand that. Planning a family or becoming parents typically coincides for most people at the time they're actually in training, and we know training is a very busy part of your life. But because of the biological clock, it also seems to be the time that most families are creating, as it were. There's also some early evidence, largely from North America, that shows that female surgeons, and we're talking about all parents this evening, but in particular female surgeons, have their children later in life, they have fewer children, and they have greater infertility issues, and we don't know why. And also talking to surgeons of all backgrounds, we've discovered that surgeons would really like more flexibility in their working lives in order to manage childcare issues, in fact, caring issues in general. And a lot of the things we talk about as regards parenthood and child caring actually applies to caring for other relatives as well. So whatever we do in this project can be expanded. Next slide, please. So out of this document, we have put upon ourselves some actions. Here's some of them. That we can do straight away, at least start working on. Firstly, we'll work with our Women in Surgery group and our Emerging Leaders programme to try and endeavour to ensure that leadership roles are available for parents. This is largely female parents at the moment with these 2 projects. For those with caring responsibilities, because we know that with caring responsibilities, it's sometimes difficult to gain access to these roles. We'd like to share examples of best practice, and of course, we'd like to raise awareness. We'd like to provide signpost resources that are useful for people involved in preparing for parenthood, being parents. And we'd like to work with all our stakeholders, which is one of the reasons why we have the Chair of COPS on this panel today, to develop a toolkit for those managing the training programs. Next slide, please. So you're going to hear a little bit later from Rachel Hutchings, who's on the panel. So our second phase has been to commission an external body, that's the Nuffield Trust that Rachel's representing today, to try and work out the extent of the problem that we have, assuming that it is a problem, to identify some key challenges and to explore some policy opportunities so that we can make things better if we can. Next slide, please. And just as a starter, this is the sign that you'll see as you come into the ground floor on the left-hand side of the college. When we started this project, we actually looked to ourselves and our brand new building, as you know we have, and realised there was not an awful lot in terms of childcare access. So we now have a baby changing room on the ground floor in the college with this wonderful sign that points to it. We have quiet rooms on 2 floors of the college for people who are coming for meetings where people may breastfeed or play with their small children. And as we know, when we have diplomates days where people come to get their fellowship and membership certificates, we allow children in as well. And we have a sort of room set aside as a semi-creche as well. Next slide, please. So from the Royal College of Surgeons point of view, anyone wishing to be involved in the current phase of PINS, Parents in Surgery, please contact us at the college, diversity@rcseng.ac.uk. And I know Rachel's going to give you another contact later on for the work that the Nuffield is doing. So thank you very much. I believe that might be my last slide. I think I'll hand over to Rachel at this point.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Yes, as mentioned in the introduction, I'm here from the Nuffield Trust. We've been commissioned by the college as part of this programme to really explore this issue in a bit more depth and identify implications for policy and also practical recommendations for change. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we're doing that, talk to you a bit about some of the early findings that we're seeing so far. And I want to emphasize at the start that we're still very much in the middle of the research project, so these are very much early findings, but to give you a bit of a flavour of what we're seeing, and then finally tell you a bit about how you can get involved if it's something that you'd like to do. Next slide, please. So I won't talk through everything on this slide, but I just want to highlight our overall aims of the project. So as I mentioned, it's really to take forward some of the work that the college has done in the early scoping phase to really explore in more depth the impact of parenting and caring on participation, progression and experience within surgical careers, to further develop the evidence base and to identify wider implications for the workforce. And in terms of how we're going about doing that, we've got a number of different methods that we're using. So firstly, we're undertaking a literature review of evidence from the UK and internationally. We're currently running a anonymous survey of those currently within or considering a surgical career to try and get at the point Fiona made about what is the extent of this issue and what are people's experiences. We're also conducting interviews with practicing and trainee surgeons to hear a bit more about people's experiences and to try and unpick some of the things that we're seeing in the data. We're doing some focus groups with medical students to unpick a bit more about the perceptions around surgical careers and the impact of parenting. And finally, we're doing some data analysis on the impact of maternity and paternity leave on career participation and progression. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, these are emerging findings predominantly from the literature review, from the survey and from the interviews. And I just want to caveat again that this is sort of what we're seeing from what we've done so far. I think in terms of the findings, there's a lot of overlap with some of the issues that were raised in the college's report and in terms of some of the wider implications as well. I just wanted to pull out a few things from these slides to just give you a bit of an insight into what we're seeing. But firstly, we're keen to understand the impact, or whether there is an impact on people's choice of career within surgery and within that particular specialties. From looking at the literature, we found that having children or wanting to have children had influenced specialty choice for 47% of respondents within this particular survey of medical graduates. But what we can see within that was that it influenced the choice for 78% of GPs, 27% of hospital doctors, but only 18% of surgeons. Interestingly, 32% of surgeons regarded their specialty as family friendly, compared to 78% of GPs and 56% of hospital specialties. So I think there's a really important thing there to unpick why that might be. From the interviews and survey we've seen so far, we have also seen that people have reported comments from earlier on in their career which have influenced decisions they've made around particularly specialty choice, around the possibility of doing surgery and having a family. In terms of participation, and within that we mean things around working hours, so working less than full time. We've really seen that there's been a huge variety of different experiences and preferences around working patterns, influenced by a whole host of different issues. We've found really variable experience in terms of access to information and support to organise things like parental leave, or put in place things like less than full-time training. And what we've kind of got a sense so far is that actually accommodating that flexibility and choice is really important. I've highlighted another study there which has also seen or shown that people have experienced challenges around working less than full-time, and particularly sort of negative perceptions from colleagues. And I think this is really important for us to understand and address. People have also talked a lot about the experience of returning to work after taking time away, and how important it is to be supported in that return, get specific support returning to a surgical career and at all career stages as well. Next slide, please. So we've also looked within our research so far at the impact on individual experience and well-being, and people have talked a lot about the unique or particular challenges within surgery, and particularly in that case around training. Talked about the kind of rigidness of the pathway and the assessment process and how that's impacted on people's experiences. People have talked a lot about the lack of guidance around when to do things like come off the on-call rota, and this has been something quite interesting when we look internationally. Actually, guidance really varies around what work people are sort of recommended that they can or can't do during pregnancy. There's real variation internationally, and from the interviews and engagement we've done so far, we've also seen a wide variation in people's experiences. We're also looking at the impact on progression, and people have talked a bit about the length of time that it can take to kind of reach those different career stages. But I think also, interestingly, from our survey so far, around 2/3 of respondents have agreed to some extent that their parental responsibilities have meant that they felt they were less able to take on leadership roles, additional activities around research, and less likely to achieve career goals. So we're really trying to unpick the extent of the issue. And finally, we've also looked at the impact outside work, and Fiona mentioned studies from the US which have looked at decisions around when females in surgical training have decided to have children, and how evidence has shown that that has happened later on in life compared to the general population. We've also seen within our survey so far, again, around 2/3 of respondents have noted an effect of their career on their decisions around parenting. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, this is very much early findings from the research so far. We'd really encourage you to take part. I just wanted to highlight that our survey is currently open. It's going to be open for at least another week. So I really do encourage you, if you want to take part, to follow the link and really share your thoughts through the survey. If you want to talk to us in a bit more depth about your experience or perspective on some of these issues, then our email address is also on the screen there. We've been having, as I said, one-to-one interviews to hear a bit more about people's experiences, and if there is something you want to share, I really do encourage you to come forward. And I've also just added a link on our website there to our project page, which talks a little bit more about all of the different bits of the research. So I hope that's given you a bit of a flavour of what we're seeing so far, but I really do encourage you to participate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. So I think now we're open to questions from the audience, and while we're waiting for those to come in, I might start by asking a few questions. Obviously, we've just published our primary report, which is a very much a first stage report. I'd like to ask the panel whether they feel what we've said so far in our report is representative of what they've seen, not necessarily personal experience, but what they've seen around them. Shall I start with Esther McClarty, since you have so many trainees under your wing?
Thank you, Fiona. Yes, the Parent in Surgery report is really quite reflective of the very many challenges of parents and carers and aspiring parents in the surgical workforce, and in fact, more globally in the medical workforce. However, I think the unpredictability of surgical hours and the dedication at times to a surgical career mean that it's particularly focused in surgery. One of the challenges that I have running programs as a TPD in the past and as a head of school is taking into account the wishes of parents and families around vacation, training times, etc. And it's hugely important. On the other hand, I have to be very even-handed and fair, that there are people who are either not in committed relationships, who have no wish to have children, and that they are treated fairly in the process. And I think it's important that they have a voice as well within this. We're a long way from making a really good training environment and working environment for surgical parents. I'm able to work because I have a partner who works incredibly flexibly to work around myself and our 6-year-old daughter. I work in a department where I have a lot of younger colleagues who also have children around the same sort of age and older. And therefore, just taking off school holidays for all of us is impractical and implausible. So there's a huge amount of flexibility. I certainly think the challenge of 2 surgeons as parents is huge. And there are clearly times in your career where it's easier or perhaps less easier to have children. Having children as a consultant, as I did, means you have a little bit more control over things and you have a degree of geographical stability. Having children when you are moving on an annual basis without necessarily a long-term plan is incredibly difficult. And I think we've got a long way to go to give people a plan going forward for more than 1 year in surgical training and to support them as well as we can.
Thank you very much. There's a lot of points there. I have to say, having been a TPD myself, yes, geography was often very difficult for people with young children, because dropping children off at the creche before going, we start work at 8 o'clock, if not 7:30. Many creches don't open at that hour, and many creches close before we come out of the operating theatre. So it can be very difficult if they then have to travel 30 miles to get to their attachment, wherever it is. A lot to be said there. Thank you, Esther. Alex, would you like to sort of, what's your feeling about the document? Do you think it's representative of what you've experienced and seen?
I think the document shows that there's huge variation. So some places have great flexibility and support, but it's far from universal. And certainly reading some of the negative experiences, they're very familiar and certainly representative of other parents who I've spoken to who've had similar problems. The report is very surgeon focused, understandably so, but I think from a truly diversity encouraging perspective, we need to look back, and it's really encouraging that Rachel's looking at people who are thinking about applying. If you're asking F2s, actually a lot of them will have already made decisions based on what they've seen, and the F1s I'm working with at the moment can see the difference in how their registrar colleagues are treated in surgery as opposed to emergency medicine, paediatrics, radiology, some of the slightly more progressive specialties that have embraced flexibility. And I think maybe that's just a generational issue, and over time I think surgery will become closer to some of the specialties that have thought more about the lives of the doctors working within the profession in training and after. And I think the report's very promising that we're moving in that direction.
Thank you, Alex. I certainly hope so. And I agree. I've come across a number of medical students and foundation trainees who said, well, I like what you do. I want to be a surgeon, but I really don't think I can do it because I want to have a family. And that shouldn't be the case. That absolutely shouldn't be the case. And there are, all of us on the panel have families. It's possible to have a family, but it does require a lot more support and juggling and help. And I think this is where we are. This is our starting point, isn't it? Rachel, just briefly from you, I appreciate that you're not a surgeon, but you've done all the research so far. Do you think what we produced in the initial report is representative so far of what you've found so far?
Yeah, I think a lot of the issues that have been raised already have really been reflected in what we've found. I think, Alex, the point you just made about variation is a really important one. We've definitely heard from some of our research so far that some people have had positive experiences, and I think that that's been really good, and it's about sort of identifying what it was about that made it positive and kind of spreading that good practice. But at the same time, we do know people have had extremely challenging experiences as well. I think that we've heard a lot about the specific challenges within surgery, a lot about the kind of training and experiences around that make it particularly difficult. Childcare is an issue that's come up a lot in conversations around the kind of practicalities of managing that, and the unpredictable hours and kind of the unpredictability of how you manage that. But I think at the same time, we have also seen that there are some wider implications as well. I think in terms of individuals' expectations around flexibility or more of a work-life balance, and what people actually want from that, I think is something that we're sort of seeing. And I think that when we do look at more detail at the perceptions of surgery from people who are maybe not in a surgical career who are at that earlier stage, we know that perceptions can influence people's decisions of where they choose to kind of pursue their career. So actually, if we want to kind of look long-term sustainability of the workforce, then actually unpicking that's really important. We have heard in some of the conversations we've had, people have reported comments, as I mentioned in my presentation, where people have sort of said or acted in a way that was surprised when people have sort of said they wanted to do surgery and have a family. And I think it's really about addressing some of those perceptions, some of that culture as well, that we know is going to influence people's decisions around how they pursue their career as well. So yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Rachel. So there's a question that's come through, which I'm going to address to some of our panelists. How have you balanced parenting and your career, and do you have any tips? I might start with Alex, actually.
Sorry, it's not a great time with background noise. Can I come back in a couple of minutes?
Of course you can. Of course you can. Esther, I'll go to you. How have you balanced parenting and your career, and do you have any tips?
Okay, so my first tip would be to choose the person you want to have your children with really carefully. And I took a long time to find my prince, and by which time I was a consultant, and he was definitely the right choice, because it's going to take a lot of support and it's going to take two of you. Now, there may be single parents out there, and there's every place for single parents in surgery as well. I just know that I personally need that support. I have found, talking to my colleagues at times of difficulty, whether I've had an ill child or particularly when I was pregnant, when I needed help, I have found talking about it and being open, being incredibly useful, and my colleagues to have been incredibly supportive. Consultants, if you're a trainee, are parents too, and they have been through an awful lot of what you may anticipate going through or maybe going through. And they've made it to consultancy, and they will generally be hugely sympathetic to whatever is going on in your life. So I would say be open, ask for help when you need it, talk to your educational supervisors, talk to your training program directors, and ask early on for a longer term plan about location and your training environment. If you need it, there are plenty of OOPS now available, including an out of program pause. So, if you need a bit of extra time with your child, if they're transitioning from preschool to school or primary school to secondary school, or they're doing their GCSEs, there are opportunities for you to come off a training pathway and spend that little bit more time. And your TPDs, your heads of school, will be incredibly sympathetic to that. The other time to talk to people around you is if you have a child with additional needs. Surgeons have children with additional needs and they have surgical careers, but your people around you cannot support you if they don't know the issues you have. And if you feel you need somebody to help you, to talk to you, to represent you, you've got your College of Surgeons tutor in hospitals in England, and you should have peer support within your programme. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Alex, are you able to come back now? How have you balanced parenting, and what tips would you give to the people out there?
I think the honest answer is some days are better than others. I think there are always compromises on both sides. I think the biggest tip I would give is trying to get some stability in where you're working, because certainly taking shared parental leave, working less than full time, if you're in one department where you know people, is much easier than if you're moving on a 12-month or 6-monthly basis. And certainly my experience of moving to the department where I took shared parental leave is I didn't get a rota until a week before starting, and the email that was sent to everybody was, I'm sorry, there are a number of registrars who are less than full time, which doesn't create an atmosphere of feeling welcome. And speaking to female colleagues who've had 2 or 3 years working in the same hospital, that they have much better experiences because they can find a niche and find a pattern that works for them. And the rota coordinators, the supervisors, are people that they know, as opposed to you being a name or somebody who's turned up once to meet the consultants before you move to the hospital. So speaking to your TPD, or if you're outside of training, you have that flexibility to choose where you work a little bit more. And certainly having geographical stability, not having an hour-and-a-half commute when you've got an under one, makes a massive difference, especially to your partner. So I would encourage people to look at location and do whatever they can for that.
Thank you, Alex. Rachel, have you come across anybody yet that's mentioned location and geography in terms of where they're working, all that?
Yeah, definitely. It's something that's come up in terms of a challenge. So the kind of lack of stability or lack of flexibility, and the implications if it means that people are maybe moving away from family support as well, and the impact that has on childcare, and things around commuting and people having to live in different parts of the country to their partner while training. So it's definitely come up as an issue, but it's also come up in the context around choice of specialty and subspecialty, and actually within that discussion, actually people choosing to work in a particular region because it means that they have less, there's less distance for them to travel, and they can base themselves in one place for a longer period of time. So I think when we talk about choice around people's decisions, it's obviously impacting on those as well. But it's definitely come up as a kind of challenge in terms of that support network and that lack of stability.
Thank you. Indeed, geography can be a bit of an issue as people apply to go into training, can't it? Because if you've got another half who is either in medicine or not in medicine, and they've got a job in a certain place, and you get a rotation that's 100 miles away, what do you do? And it'd be interesting in your research whether you find out whether people are actually not going into surgery because they haven't got a job close enough to actually pursue their career. Because of the way that we perform national selection in the UK. Thank you very much. So somebody has asked, do we see a future in which working in surgery or medicine in general can be family friendly? That's implying that it's not. And how do we get there? Do we think it's family friendly, at least a bit family friendly, Esther?
I think it can be. I think the difficulty and the elephant in the room is the surgical care of emergency out of hours patients, or of patients, elective patients on the ward who get unwell out of hours. So surgery is never going to be anything other than a 7-day-a-week, 24-hour week specialty for some. But whether we can provide attractive surgical careers with high performance levels required in a more family-friendly working environment with some stability of hours, I think we really have to look at. At the moment, most consultants will be aware of the flexibility that's required to cover other consultants' lists when they're off for holidays or sickness or whatever else. And in fact, flexibility is really key to productivity. However, that's not going to be good for all. And some people may need much more certainty in their days and times of work. And we have to be able to be a broad church for all. And therefore, choosing your region, your hospital, your environment, and your subspecialty can be really key. But if you're passionate about a particular surgical specialty, that in this day and age, you should be able to follow it, whatever your parental status or caring status.
Yes, I like the should. Yes, you should be able to. You should be able to pursue your career, because if you're passionate about something, one would expect that you would do it well. And what we need is good surgeons, and what we need is a strong and happy workforce. But I agree, we're not quite there yet. Alex, anything you'd like to add to that?
So I think to be optimistic, in some places you certainly can be a surgeon in a happy, family appreciating environment. And certainly some of the orthopedic consultants I work with are very happy with their arrangements. And certainly having a consultant job or a non-training substantive post does allow you to have more time to plan flexibility with your colleagues. Rotation in a 24/7 working environment is a real challenge, and there are different ways of running a workforce, but it comes down to having a workforce plan both on a national and a local level. And unfortunately, I think we're all just firefighting in the short term, and it's very difficult to look long term at workforce planning. Some regions and hospitals have very good combined rotas with doctors and, for want of a better word, the extended surgical team, but that is incredibly variable, and I think ultimately it does come down to an individual hospital, an individual department, and the people that you're working with. And the challenge is trying to make that more family friendly across the board. And I'm hoping that we can do that, but it's going to be a challenge.
Yes, we have a lot of challenges ahead of us. Esther mentioned earlier that it might be more difficult, or there were different difficulties for dual surgeon families. In fact, I'm a dual surgeon family, as Esther knows, and we spent a lot of our time when our child was young swapping in and out of our on-calls so that we were never on call the same night. Because if you can imagine, you can't leave a child on their own if you both have to go out on call. So having two surgeons in the family meant that there were quite often 5 days in a row where one or other of us were on call. And it did mean a lot of juggling with arranging childcare, both not only during the daytime, but actually in the evening as well, because you never know what time you're going to come home. There is a question that's come up that I think is probably a good question for Rachel. It says, will there be an aspect of interviewing family and partners of surgeons to get their perspective in addition to interviewing the surgeons and trainees of the future themselves?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question. It's not something that we'd specified in the current kind of plan for the work, but actually I think it is a really, really important one, especially given some of the issues that have been raised in the discussion so far. So I'd say if that's something that people are interested in who are on the webinar, please do get in touch with the Parents in Surgery email address. And it's also something that we will talk to our colleagues who are working with at the college about how we can maybe facilitate getting that perspective, because I think it is a really important issue.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Esther another question because she has such a breadth of experience. Do you think, without naming names, that there are pockets of training in the country which have already good areas of good practice that we could learn from?
So yes, I think there are. The representation of females in surgical specialties varies hugely dependent upon the specialty. And to reach parity between trainees, we're looking to around 20/60 plus in cardiac, neuro and orthopedics. Whereas in other specialties, we're now at about 50/50 already. We have a particularly good representation of females in Peninsula. We have 48% of our general surgeons, the last time I counted, were female, 52% of our urologists, and 80% of our ENT surgeons in training. Now, we also had 80% of our ENT surgeons who were less than full-time training. I'd have to say they are not the same 80%. So we're now looking at a situation where we're likely to have a lot of programs where the majority of trainees work less than full-time, where rota organisers are absolutely going to have to get used to the idea, and should be used to the idea already, that a number of trainees does not mean a number of full-time equivalent trainees, and that all rotas need a little bit of extra resilience booked into them and built into them, because running a 1 in 7 rota with 7 people is not going to work. It's going to be running a 1 in 7 rota with 8 or 9 or 10 going forwards, and it needs a lot more planning. But resilience built into the workforce is really important. It's never been there, but we seriously need to have a rethink and a redesign about that now.
Thank you. Alex, you've had some experience with less than full-time training. Did you find it was easy to access?
I found it very difficult to access because you're constantly being given different advice from different people. And sometimes that can be very well intentioned, particularly who've been less than full-time in the past. And for example, if a consultant has struggled with being a parent and gone through training 15 years ago, they may think, oh, well, the issues will be the same, the employment side will be the same. And actually, it can be quite difficult if you think you've been given very good advice but find that it's out of date. Equally, going from one department to the next, one hospital to the next, you're often told conflicting advice. And one of the things that I found very useful, about 5 years ago, the college ran a less than full-time working day in Liverpool, and I don't think that's been repeated since then, but it was really useful to hear the experiences of other people and see what they've been through, because often you might be speaking to a rota coordinator who doesn't have experience of what you're suggesting. So many departments will be used to a female trainee going less than full-time for childcare reasons. As soon as you are asking to be less than full-time for non-childcare reasons, or you're doing it as a father, it will be unusual, and some rota coordinators will struggle with that. Speaking to colleagues in emergency medicine, I think it was very difficult there 5 or 10 years ago, but I think because they've been forced, they're now very willing to accommodate flexibility. And I think that's promising, that it does show that cultures can change. And we need to move from a situation where a deanery or a hospital doesn't say, oh, this person is working 60% of the time, there's a 40% gap that we need to fill, but rather, oh, great, we've got somebody who can do the job and fill 60% of the shifts. But I don't think that that is the culture. I didn't have very much negative perception directed to me directly, but certainly speaking to my supervisors, I was told that things were said to them. And I think that's very difficult, that if you're looking at culture and perception, there will always be comments of, oh, well, in my day, we worked 12 days in a row and we had continuity of care. But actually, if you look at the consultant working practices and the full-time trainees in any department, we don't have true continuity. Yet it's seen as a problem that's specific to people working less than full-time. And other specialties seem to have moved beyond that, but surgery are struggling.
Do you have any perception as to why we are behind the curve as surgeons? Because we're all doctors, aren't we? Why do you think, any idea why that might be? I see we have another panel member there.
I think there is certainly a feeling from some consultants, and this is far from universal, that, well, life was tough in my day and people nowadays have it easy, therefore you just need to get on with it. And the real problem with that is we end up with consultants who are able to put up with bad practice rather than the people who were necessarily the most motivated and the most talented at the start of the process. And some of the best surgical house officers we've had over the last few years would have been great surgeons, and a generation ago would probably have applied. But now they can look and say, I can get a radiology job with run-through training, be a consultant in 5 years. Why would I put myself through core surgical training and the surgical pathway for a career that will give me less flexibility and financially not be as rewarding? So that there are a number of factors that go together.
And you mentioned finances, and I think one of the differences between now and 20, 30 years ago, I think, is that it's finances don't go quite so far now, and more often now we have both parents working full time. Whereas I think a long time ago it was somewhat more common. I'm not going to generalize too much, but more common for the wife, shall I say, to be at home or to have perhaps a part-time job. Whereas now you will find that most couples are both working full time, and that, I think that does make it harder, particularly if you're both in the medical profession with the hours being difficult, or in high-powered jobs, whatever they are.
I think one thing at the moment that is not always discussed, if you look at surgical registrars, there's a number of us in our mid to late 30s, and in other specialties they would have been consultants for a number of years. That looking at colleagues who I worked with and are now relatively senior A&E radiology consultants, and also looking at SHO locums, they can earn considerably more than a senior registrar without going into training and without moving on to a registrar position. So I think if you look at the F2, F3 doctors, that they're aware that there are other options, and people are making decisions based on what's best for them, and that's fully understandable.
Yes, it's a shame, isn't it? Because surgery is a fantastic career. Those of us who are surgeons, we love our jobs, but trying to fit the other sides of life. Someone said to me the other day that work-life balance is probably not the right phrase to use, because it implies that work and living are not the same thing. In other words, it implies that when you go to work, you're not living. Actually, if you enjoy your job, you are living when you go to work. It's more like a work-home balance, isn't it? But what we need is to work out how to get a better work-home balance. Okay, so now that we've published the report, I think we're running out of time. Now that we've published the report, and Rachel, we've got you and your team working, what do we all think should be the next steps? Rachel, I might go to you first, actually.
Yeah, so I think from our perspective, obviously our immediate next steps are to continue with the research and try and make sure that we get as good a grasp of the issues as possible, really. So really look at a broad, build that evidence base as much as we can to really understand how this issue is affecting people in lots of different ways. We've already seen that, you know, there's a lot of challenges, but I think it's really about understanding with a bit more of that data and information, actually, what is the extent of the issue. I think from our perspective, then our next steps are about, okay, well, what do we actually do with that? How do we really change culture, change working practices for people so that actually we can spread where there is that good practice? And I think for us, it's also about looking at more widely, what are the implications for the wider workforce? You know, we had the question earlier on about how do you make surgery or medicine more generally family friendly, and does that assume we're not there at the moment? I think that, you know, as we've seen in our research, there's a lot of really good examples of where that's happening, but we know that there are some people who still don't have that experience and don't see that that is what they have in their day-to-day career. So I think it's about how we look at kind of at an individual level, kind of those practical things that can be done, but also at a policy level, how we can look at making sure that medicine as a whole is actually seen as a family-friendly profession, and is something that we can kind of make sure people stay in those careers as well.
Thank you. And Esther, with your chair of COPS hat on, where do you think we should go next?
So I think what we're not very good is sharing experience. I mean, surgery is a wonderful career. It's absolutely possible to combine it with having children and be successful. And, you know, we may need to look really carefully at the different timings. There may be people who currently are penalised in selection who have children early and then want to come back into the surgical workforce. And there may be people who want to take a little pause. It strikes me that the information about childcare, every time you move rotation, you have to go and find it out for yourself. And there isn't a resource bank and experience and even, you know, some registered babysitters for your next trust that are passed between organisations and between people as they move. So I think there's an awful lot that could be done just to make transition between posts and regions an awful lot easier. I also think one of the things that used to keep, you know, two surgeons working with children was the ability to afford a nanny. And with legislation and minimum wage and being responsible for maternity leave, etc. now, it's actually very difficult on two trainees' salaries to do that sort of thing. So much more flexible childcare needs to be brought in by large hospitals and institutions to cater for the whole workforce, and that includes surgical hours. We have an excellent nursery aligned to my hospital in Derriford that has extended hours, but the minute a child goes to a local school, that provision disappears. So you suddenly get another crisis between the 4 to 5 transition and potentially later on when they move into secondary school. And lots of people have been through this before, but that knowledge and experience and solutions are not well shared. So I think there's a huge amount to be done about sharing information and sharing experience. And I really think it's important that we bang the drum that you can do both. You might need to change your priorities. You might need to go through training and progression to a consultancy in a slower time frame and do it at your own pace. But my goodness, you can do it. What you can't get upset about is people who perhaps prioritize their surgical career above all else, moving ahead of you, and it's just life. And this, by the way, is a mummy necklace that's just been made for me. Thank you, darling.
Oh, that's lovely. That's beautiful. Isn't your mummy lucky? Thank you. Alex, what would you say? What as a trainee, what do you think? Where do you think we should go next, representing the trainees?
So I don't think I represent the trainees, so I'd like to just put that out there. But I'm going to repeat what Rachel and Esther have said, that there are good examples, and I think trying to make those more visible is really important. That there's a role for doing this top down, and COPs and the deaneries can learn from good examples, and where that's worked well, we should try and share that and spread that across the board. But I think we also need to go from the bottom and look at individual doctors and say, well, this is how it can be done. There is flexibility. You don't have to give up your plan to pursue surgery because a different speciality is making things easier for a more flexible life. We can improve things in the future. And I think approaching it from both sides is the right thing, but trying to spread the message from a college which is allowing flexible working and appreciates the difficulties of working out of hours to individual hospitals where managers and workforce shortages is such a major problem at the moment is a real challenge, and maybe more money is needed to support the workforce in general, and that's a difficult thing to say at this moment.
Thank you very much. I think very much thank you very much everyone for the discussion. There's also an awful lot to do, isn't there, for trainees, for non-training doctors as well, to ensure that people can have families and have a career in surgery, because we know that surgery is a rewarding career, and as demonstrated on screen right now, you can be a successful surgeon and have a beautiful child, and happy child. I mean, so it is possible. But there's a long way to go. It sounds like we're going to need to share a lot of information. I think it sounds like if we could help with producing rotas, less than full-time rotas that people can work with, provide information about what's available to people who are looking to become pregnant, are pregnant, have children. And if the college can help with any of those things, I think we would have made a start. And as we said at the beginning, this isn't really only a surgeon's problem, but we've got to start somewhere. And there do seem to be some particular issues that happen in surgery. Would anybody like to make any last comments before we wrap up? Rachel.
Thanks, Fiona. No, I think that's absolutely true, and I think it is about emphasising. We have heard some really good examples of people who've had really positive experiences, and it's really possible, and it shows that where people are supported, they can have, still have that really rewarding career. So it's about making that universal in terms of the flexibility and having a situation that does work for everybody. I guess my final plea would just be, please do get in touch with us if you want to take part in this study. Please fill in the survey and email us if you've got any thoughts that you want to share based on what's been said tonight. Would really encourage you to do that. But yeah, just to say thank you for having me today. It's been a really interesting discussion.
Thank you. And there's an email address in the chat to get in contact with the Nuffield Trust regarding this. Esther.
So I think this is going to be a work in progress and a long time project. I would like to see a training package as well from the college around less than full-time training, OOPS, etc., supporting trainees with caring responsibilities. That might be accessed by training program directors, TPDs, etc. There's quite a bit of it within HEE, but that doesn't always pick up the college tutors, who are an excellent resource in England for trainees, and all trusts in England should have one, we hope. So, they are a hugely useful resource, and even if they can't help a trainee currently with what's going on, they will be able to signpost people who can help. And there's also resource within the deaneries. Changing culture within trusts and within senior medical workforce, however, will be an ongoing long-term goal. But other specialties have done it. There's no reason why we can't.
Thank you very much. Any last comments, Alex?
So, thank you. I think that women in surgery, parents in surgery are really good at directing resources and getting people to engage, but I'd really like to see flexibility brought in across the board, because I don't want parents to be treated differently. I want everybody to have a good opportunity to work and enjoy a life outside of work. Children getting ill is a problem, but actually the least sympathetic that my colleagues have been is actually when my mother went into the emergency department and I was late coming into work from that. And there's a huge amount of caring that's done outside of parenting. My number one tip, if you want to work flexibly, is actually not to speak to doctors and not to speak to deaneries, but if you go to the HR people in the trust, they will know the legislation that's current and up to date, and they are outside of the pressures of rotas and filling gaps. So speak to HR would be my number one tip.
A very good tip. And as a final message, that's an excellent tip. Thank you very much, Alex. I'd like to thank all our panel today. We've come out of time now. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. This will be available on our website. Particularly for those of you who are actually not here and probably bathing a baby. And if you do want to get in touch, either with us at the college, definitely with the Nuffield for the ongoing research. And if you have any comments or anything you wish to discuss, then please get in touch with us. Thank you very much, everybody.